Aristotle, the Poetics, a work on aesthetics, first transcribed probably between 334 and 323 BC. The principal ideas of which are that poetry is imitation of human life in its universal aspects. The arts differ according to the medium, manner and object of imitation. Tragedy is the imitation of serious action, achieving through pity and fear a catharsis of those emotions. The tragic hero is a man better than most who brings about his own downfall because of a flaw in his character. The three most important moments in a tragedy are the reversal of fortune, the discovery of the critical fact which hastens the denouement, and the suffering, and the final submission of the hero. The Poetics was one of Aristotle's briefest works to begin with, and only half of it has been preserved. Nevertheless, it contains so many fruitful insights and canons of literary art that it has been turned into constantly by literati and philosophers ever since Aristotle's time. It has a history of varying interpretations as well as varied manuscripts. The present review, this review of mine, is making use of principally anyway, of the translation and commentary by S.H. Butcher. I can't even get his name right. Anyway, it's a well-known standard translation. Unlike most of Aristotle's work, this one contains little argument. Rather, it simply analyzes poetic art as it existed in Aristotle's time and as he understood it. The lasting influence of the work attests to the worth of his observations. Modern readers, of course, must make adjustments for the narrower scope and achievement of literature of that day and for the specific nature, particularly in metrics of the Greek language. The Poetics, as we know it, treats tragedy and very briefly epic poetry. The second portion on comedy has been lost. All kinds of poetry, Aristotle finds, are modes of imitation of character, emotion and action. But they differ in respect to, first, the medium of imitation, which includes rhythm, meter or language, and harmony or tune, and second, the manner of imitation, that is, whether staged as a play or sung or narrated, and three, the objects of imitation. The objects of all artistic imitations are actions, and these always have some degree of moral quality. Hence, men and women must be portrayed as either better than in real life, or worse, or the same. The difference between tragedy and comedy, Aristotle affirms, is that tragedy aims at representing men or women better than they actually are, and comedy as worse. Aristotle defines tragedy as an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. The terms of this definition have undergone much interpretation. Butcher states that action, praxis, for Aristotle included the whole life of the mind as well as mere motion of the body, an inner energy working outward. This is the object imitated by drama and other arts, and under this interpretation, dramatic action is much more than physical action alone. Imitation, mimesis, was a term used disparagingly by Plato and perhaps popularly, to which Aristotle gives a new meaning. Since the object of poetic imitation was human life, and human nature, imitation meant an expression of the universal element in human life. Aesthetically, the real and the ideal come together in this way. The ideal is the real, freed from limitations of alien influences and chance, and enabled to work out its own development from beginning to end. This imitation became a creative process which could improve on nature, which is an interesting idea. Improving on nature, I mean. Anyway. Purgation, catharsis, is applied in the definition to pity and fear, by which the spectator is moved. Reference to the Poetics, to the rhetoric, and to contemporary medical writings shed more light on this purgation than the Poetics does alone. Aristotle considered pity and fear painful emotions. Pity is what one feels upon observing another in a situation in which he would fear for himself, just as the playing of frenzied music has the effect of calming those possessed, an actual practice in Aristotle's time. The presentation of events arousing pity and fear would allay those emotions latent in the spectator and thus bring pleasure. These are the universal elements of human nature that it is proper for tragedy in particular to imitate. Tragedy requires 6 parts: rhythm, song, metrical wording. These 3 are the kinds of ornament that embellish the language: spectacle, the staging of the play; character, of those portrayed; and their thought. What the completeness of tragedy requires, however, is that the piece have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Although not necessarily in that order, as I think Jean-Luc Godard said, anyway. In that order for Aristotle. A beginning is that which does not necessarily follow anything, but is naturally followed by something else. An end is what must follow another thing, but need not be followed by anything. A middle both follows and must be followed by something else. As to magnitude, the imitation should not be so long as to give difficulty in remembering or comprehending the action. But within this limitation, the longer it may be, the finer a creative production. Further, it must be long enough to allow naturally a change from good to bad fortune, or bad to good. The action must be both single and complete, such that to add or subtract an element of plot would disorganize or disrupt rather than enhance the action. In these descriptions, Aristotle recognized the dramatic principle of unity of action, which, along with the unities of time and place that he suggested, were zealously observed in neoclassical times. Plot, Aristotle says, is the very soul of tragedy. Being the arrangement of the incidents, it is what portrays the action. And I quote, "For tragedy is an imitation not of men, but of an action and of life, and life consists in action, and its end is a mode of action, not of quality." Character determines men's qualities, and these, together with their thought, determine their actions. Dramatic action, therefore, does not aim at the representation of character. Character is subsidiary to the action. Aristotle approves the origin of the plots of most Greek tragedies in Greek myth. In telling the nature of tragedy, he states that a poet is unlike a historian, not writing about what has happened, but rather about what may happen. Thus he acknowledges the transformation of events by the poetic imagination. Plato had barred poets, whom he considered immoral falsifiers, from the ideal republic until they could write poetry convincingly arguing for their own reinstatement. In other words, poetry should be didactic, or argumentative, and have a moral purpose. Aristotle in the Poetics attempts to rehabilitate poetry from this low estimate. He shows here a function of poetry which Plato had entirely overlooked. For if poetry imitates what ought to happen rather than what has happened, it imitates the universal rather than the particular. Hence, poetry, Aristotle concludes, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history. Aristotle recognizes 3 parts of the plot of tragedy, calling plots complex when so divided, and simple if there are no divisions. One part is reversal of the situation, or peripeteia, such as when an act of the hero produces the opposite from the intended effect. Another is recognition or discovery, anagnosis. I don't know Greek, by the way, in which a character acquires knowledge of a fact, producing in him love or hate toward another character. These two, when simultaneous, are most effective in arousing pity or fear. The third part of the complex plot is the final suffering. It does not turn upon a surprise, as do the others, but like them will be most effective as a probable or natural outcome of other events. What of the person chiefly concerned in these actions? The tragedy must not bring a perfectly virtuous man from prosperity to adversity, nor raise a bad man from adversity to prosperity, nor yet depict a villain receiving his deserts, for none of these would both satisfy the moral sense and still inspire pity and fear. Aristotle brings us thus to the remaining possibility: a man not eminently good and just, but unmarked by vice or depravity, who is brought to adversity by some error or fault, hamartia. Hence Aristotle seems perhaps to contradict the earlier statement that tragedy shows men better in real life, for such would seem to be eminently good men. Part of the difficulty lies in the translation of hamartia, which has variously been rendered tragic flaw, conveying the idea of a radical character trait like excessive pride or error in judgment, conveying simply a mistaken interpretation of some event. At any rate, Aristotle seems to intend a hero who falls short of perfection, yet is better than men usually are, and whose virtue and shortcomings both are related to the events of the drama in which he is set. Thus the best tragedy will have a complex rather than a simple plot, and since it concerns the sort of character described above, it will show a change from prosperity to adversity. The fear and pity which come from the structure of the tragedy, such as when a hero intends or performs harm to a man without knowing him to be his father or his son, is superior to the fear and pity arising from the spectacle alone, as when we see the violent act performed. 4 requirements are laid upon character. First, it must be good. Any speech or action that shows moral purpose will express character, and if the purpose is good, will express good character. Second is propriety. Any trait must be appropriate to the person in whom depicted. Third, the character must be true to life. Last, it must be consistent, or if inconsistent, at least consistently inconsistent. The construction of both plot and character should aim at the necessary, the probable, and the rational. If deviations occur, they must be outside the scope of tragedy. Both the complication and the unravelling of the plot must arise out of causes within the plot itself, and a deus ex machina should be used only for events antecedent or subsequent to those of the plot. And while the depiction of character should be true to life, it should be yet more beautiful, like a portrait. The 2 stages of the plot are the complication and the unravelling, or denouement. The complication contains everything up to the turning point to good or bad fortune. The unravelling extends from the beginning point of the change to the end of the play. The dramatist should master both. With respect to existing tragedies, there are 4 types. 1. The complex, depending entirely on reversal of the situation and recognition. 2. The pathetic, in which the motive is passion. 3. The ethical, where the motives are moral. And 4. The simple. If possible, the poet should attempt to combine all elements to produce the best type, the complex. He should not attempt to take an epic structure, which has a multiplicity of plots, and make it into a tragedy. Even the chorus should be regarded as one of the actors, and the choral songs should share in the action rather than serve as mere interludes. As to thought, little needs to be added to what has been said in the rhetoric. Thought comprises every effect produced by speech and has as subdivisions 1. Proof and refutation. 2. The excitation of the feelings such as pity, anger, fear. 3. The suggestion of degree of importance, amplification. Just as incidents which speak for themselves without verbal exposition, the speeches should effectively produce the speaker's desired effect on their own strength. Turning to the diction of poetry, Aristotle classifies words as either current, strange, metaphorical, ornamental, newly coined, lengthened, contracted, or altered. The latter 5 are used by the poet for his immediate purposes of expression or meter. A word is strange if used in another country, current if in general use in one's own. Metaphor is the transference of a name from one thing to another by certain relationships which Aristotle carefully describes. It may transfer a name from a genus to a species of it, or from a species to genus, or from species to species, or by analogy or proportion. In metaphor by analogy or proportion, the second term is to the first as the fourth term is to the third. For example, old age is to life as evening is to day. So we may speak of the evening of life.